with the elite. I know this. I know this. Speaking for myself, I went to better schools than they did. I have nicer houses than they do. I have nicer apartments. I have nicer everything. And they're elite. But we're not elite. You people work your asses off. You're making a lot of money. You're smarter than they are. You're smarter than they are. Antifa, you ever see Antifa?
Donald Trump is with us on the phone. Mr. Trump, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Not sure if you have been...
What is your opinion on Brazilian Prime Minister Bolsonaro regarding, this last thing's moving here, deforestation of the rainforest? P.S. I'm a Christian, I bake you a cake though. I don't know enough about him, but it sounds like he really hates Marxism and he's really pushing Brazil to become more of a world leader, and that he actually is for capitalism, and he's trying to get some of the SJW stuff out of the schools. I just saw a tweet by him a day or two ago. So on that front, and again, I don't know a ton about him, that all sounds good to me.
I want to inform the Bolivian people and the whole world what the press already know, that a coup d'etat is underway. A coup d'etat against the government that was democratically elected with more than 60% of votes in the last elections. This is a coup d'etat against social movements, workers, a coup d'etat against patriotic professionals, the humble, the indigenous, against all of us who have brought a democratically led revolution. It's a coup d'etat by violent groups, by anti-democratic groups that don't respect democracy. They don't respect the results of the last national election, and above all, they don't respect social change.
Pido a los patriotas.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where we say Lula finally livre with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello, Lula livre.
Chief economist David Griscom.
Lula livre.
Indeed, Lula livre, everybody. The world's most prominent political prisoner released and already hitting the streets for global transformation. We'll talk about that, celebrate. And I will say, without getting into too much detail, but this community helped make that happen. Along, of course, with the great Brazil Wire, the incredible reporting by Glenn Greenwald and Victor Poggi at The Intercept. But TMBS community held the flame. And our friends in Brazil are aware, is all I'll say. More about that in the future. Very exciting. On this week's program, Shahid Buttar. He's an incredible, dynamic politician and leader, and he's here in studio. We're talking about his run against Nancy Pelosi, the new report by the Tony Blair Institute on technology, and what an actual democratic representation on tech monopolies would do in Congress. Plus, what are his responses to the catastrophe that we are witnessing right now? The almost certainly CIA US-backed coup in Bolivia. Evo Morales, democratically elected in 2006, radically cut poverty, expanded the rights of the indigenous, and yes, was not a god man without any flaws or mistakes, yet still should not be a victim of a coup. All of you foolish moron moralists out there. We'll be talking about the Bolivia coup, a proactive foreign policy for democracy and anti-empire, anti-imperial order, and more. And then the great Richard Wolff, he returns. What was the Soviet Union? How does it fit into our story and history? What are possible socialist futures? And an intro to Marx's 18th Brumaire. All that and much, much more. Plus, of course, a gem, a shout out. Bernie Sanders, as expected, reinvented the game with a extremely impressive immigration plan, which of course was coming. And then in the post game, Glassjaw Warren, folks, Glassjaw Warren. Elizabeth Warren does not impress, nor does Uber and Jeremy Corbyn. You got to get out there and pull all the stops for labor. So jam-packed show. But first, let's talk about the contradictory news out of Latin America this weekend. Now, as of today, Bolivia is in the midst of a vicious far-right coup. And let's be very clear about some things. There is absolutely no evidence other than an assertion by the Organization of American States that the vote was tampered with or that there was any irregularities. In fact, all social trends, all political trends in Bolivia would point very easily to a 47% Morales win, which was indeed the margin that he won by. The Organization of American States has regularly interfered in elections. Two recent examples that Mark Weisbrot articulates are elections in 2000 and 2010 in Haiti, where the OAS has either preemptively called out an election, which facilitated, which just negated the results in full and facilitated the election of one of the original global clown fascists, Sweet Mickey, in Haiti at the behest of the United States and the Clinton State Department. In 2000, the OAS, after initially sort of heralding those elections and the return of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, went on to reverse themselves after a Bush administration and Canadian-backed 2004 coup in Haiti. Now, yes, it's not a legitimate organization and it's U.S. dominated, but if they had come forward with some actual compelling evidence, we would have to weigh it. There is none other than a discrepancy in one vote calculation system, which is not official, and another that is official. Now, it makes a lot of sense if you look at the Mark Weisbrot report, along with Guillermo Long, Ecuador's former foreign minister, who will be our guest next week, that basically the first vote, the non-official tally, is measuring early returns from areas where AVO does not perform as well. It is not a surprise that as voting counts came in from the rest of the country, that Morales would come through with a win. This should not particularly surprise anybody. I mean, in some ways, this is analogous to, thankfully and happily, Shama Sawant retained her seat. Well, the first returns came in, showed her opponent with a lead. Then other ballots came in areas that favored her, and she won. That doesn't mean there was any thievery. AVO offered to have another election. AVO reached out to everybody else in civil society. And how this ended was the military telling him to leave, which is literally the textbook definition of a coup. Now right-wing mobs are terrorizing members of Bolivia's government across the streets. They're burning indigenous people's flags. They are frog-marching people out of parliament. This is a classic right-wing enabled Latin American coup. Now, on the other hand, Lula da Silva, global icon, the world's most important political prisoner, who of course lifted 40 million people out of poverty in Brazil, who would have cruised to election in 2018 if it was not for the corrupt, hackish Lava Jato task force putting him in jail on trumped-up charges, was finally released after the Supreme Court reversed itself. In 2018, the Supreme Court subverted the Brazilian constitution and said that Lula should be sent to jail, taken out of the election, and silenced. He wasn't even allowed to give interviews before exhausting all of his repeals in this ridiculous case about the beachfront condo. Now, they've reversed themselves and said, of course, Lula, as well as several thousand other prisoners, should be able to exhaust their appeals. Lula is out, and it's an incredible inspiration for the world and an important step for the global left. Let's watch some of this report from Michael Fox, great reporter at Real News Network, with some great clips of Lula's speech. First, he addressed, when he got out, the Lula visual in Curitiba and thanked everybody and hugged everybody and went through the crowd. And this was back home in San Bernardino Parish, I believe, in São Paulo, which is at the Metalworkers Union, his political home and base.
During Lula's first speech back home in São Bernardo do Campo on Saturday, he railed against Bolsonaro's widespread privatization plan and his alleged connections with the paramilitaries accused of killing Rio de Janeiro councilwoman Marielle Franco last year. Bolsonaro was democratically elected. We accept the results of the election. This guy has a mandate for 4 years. But he was elected to govern for the Brazilian people and not to govern for the paramilitaries in Rio de Janeiro. Though Lula is out of prison, he is not done fighting to clear his name. He was freed by a Supreme Court decision which ruled it unconstitutional to imprison defendants before they had exhausted all of their appeals. Lula's defense team is working to have his conviction and other cases against him thrown out due to bias by the Anti-Corruption Task Force and his jailer, Judge Sergio Moro, who was implicated in the Intercept revelations and who is now Bolsonaro's justice minister. Meanwhile, inequality and poverty are on the rise, and Lula is now planning to tour the country. He says he wants to once again stand up for the working class and to rebuild the Brazil that he says Bolsonaro has been working actively to destroy.
Eu quero construir este país com a mesma alegria.
I want to build this country with the same happiness that we built it when we governed this country. My dream isn't to solve my problems. Today I'm a guy that doesn't have a job, a president without a pension. There's not even a television in my apartment. My life is totally blocked. The only thing I'm certain of is that I have more courage to fight than ever before. Mike Fox, The Real News, Curitiba, Brazil.
Lula is incredible. And I just want to say that this is incredibly important. We'll get to the global dimension of this in a second. But Lula's first term, 2 terms, and the Workers' Party were an immense success. And applying puritanical standards, whether we are talking about Morales or Chavez or Maduro or Lula, whether you're going at it from the no one can ever be left enough perspective or you must always be pristine and godly, this is a bratty and delusional perspective about people attempting to govern to the left in the hemisphere and the political periphery. Also, the Lula of today in different historical and material circumstances recognizes a different strategic position. He came out and he said, I've moved to the left. And in addition to his searing indictment of Bolsonaro and the paramilitaries, he spoke about Uber and the temp economy and global instability and labor union organizing in that context. As is always the case, Bernie Sanders stands alone. He tweeted out his support for President Lula. As president, oh wait, that's the Bolivia one. You got it? All right, just 1 second. So, and also today, Lula and Bernie Sanders spoke on the phone. But do we have it up? This is Bernie. As president, Lula has done more than anyone to lower poverty in Brazil and stand up for workers. I'm delighted he's been released from jail, something that never should have happened in the first place. Absolutely. And here was Lula's response. This was incredibly moving. Thank you for your solidarity. You've always been my candidate for the U.S. presidency, and I hope Democrats have the wisdom to nominate a candidate with your worldview. I hope American workers will make you U.S. president. Now, I just have to say, as a brief parenthetical, Lula da Silva, Cardi B, Cornel West, Killer Mike, Adolph Reed, and Danny DeVito, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. I don't know what the fuck else you need to know about who to vote for in this election. Bernie Sanders also recently, and of course Jeremy Corbyn, put out incredibly strong statements on both Lula being released and the coup in Bolivia. This is Bernie Sanders on Bolivia. I'm very concerned about what appears to be a coup in the Bolivia, where a military, after weeks of political unrest, intervened to remove President Evo Morales. The U.S. must act for an end to violence and support Bolivia's democratic institutions. Now, don't fixate on the wording. I agree. Obviously, it's a coup. It goes without saying. It doesn't appear to be. Ilhan Omar's tweet was great and clear in that regard. But there is a strategic play to be had here, and the bottom line is of doing it. Bernie Sanders did it. And no other candidate, including one with a lot of plans who I actually heard laughably is more progressive than him, or the other one that is the peace one, have had anything to say about Bolivia so far and nothing to say about Lula ever. So let's be real. We're building a global left, and this sense of solidarity is powerful, palpable, and matters. And you know who understands it? The odious Steve Bannon, who said on Brazil, Portuguese, BBC in Brazil, the following. We'll just hit translate. Steve Bannon, Lula is the biggest idol of the globalist left in the world, and his freedom will bring a huge disturbance to Brazil. Well, working backwards, it will bring a disturbance to the neo-fascist, grotesque pigs that align with Steve Bannon in Brazil. Bolsonaro, Moro, and all these other disgusting clown fascists that align in this global movement to cause so much stupidity, human and ecological suffering. But Lula is no globalist unless we mean something different by globalist. And who knows what Steve exactly means by globalist. But if we're going to take him at his supposed terms, Lula is not a neoliberal. He may have governed, again, I know purity lefties, yes. He accepted the world as it was and still got Brazil out of hunger and lifted 40 million out of poverty in 2003 to 2010. But his politics, his orientation are of the union, solidarity, and solid left mode. And his empathy, his compassion, his clear strategic capacity, and his stature as a global statesman is exactly the kind of politics that, in spite of all of the setbacks and all of the suffering, can defeat a dead, hollowed out, and utterly discredited Macron, Trudeau, Clinton, Obama neoliberalism and the neo-fascist thuggery of Steve Bannon that it is born. So Sloppy Steve is right. Big disturbance in the force, not just for Brazil, but the whole world. Lula Livre, solidarity with Bolivia. Don't let anybody tell you it's not a coup. And remind them how much Evo cut poverty. All right, guys, you have anything you want to add to that?
I just want to say very quickly, so there's no doubters in the audience, that the allegations that there was electoral fraud in Bolivia are so outlandish. There has been no demonstration that the vote totals were messed with. The OAS allegations is that the quick tally, which is sent out to the media throughout the process, right, was interrupted. But the official tallies are also sent out to the media, and they were updated online throughout that process. So the OAS, to say that there's electoral fraud, or anyone who repeats that, is not telling you the whole truth. And this is a very frightening example of a moment where if you repeat a lie long enough, people start to believe it. Absolute solidarity with the people of Bolivia, absolutely against this coup.
100%. And of course, the Washington Post and the New York Times and all the other failed and failing journalistic outlets cannot bring themselves to say coup. And in tonight's bad, we will have a contrast tweet. Apparently, being in power from 2006 when you're in Germany is fine, but from Bolivia is not. All right, let's get to the shout out. Shout out, shout out, shout out.
My brain is still in recovery mode.
Shout out, shout out, shout out.
My brain is still in recovery mode.
Shout out, shout out.
From taking in so many high-level important ideas. Shout out, shout out. From taking in so many high-level important ideas. The dial of ideas. I like talking about ideas. High level. The exchange of ideas. Shout out, shout out. High level. Still in recovery mode. Looking forward to sharing more ideas.
Oh, as expected, Bernie Sanders has put out the most bold, innovative, left and humane immigration plan. And we will have some words from one of his prime competitors on her thoughts on this in the post game. Now, again, this is really important because Bernie threaded a needle between two competing sets of demands. There's one set of demands that does essentially say we can keep this issue on the back burner and we can continue to some way in shape or form dehumanize a terrorized community through particularly the Trump administration, but the entirety of the American immigration system as a whole on a bipartisan basis. Then there were people who elevated, frankly, a utopian rhetoric over the political demands and realities of actually winning a presidential campaign, and at times confused rhetorical and stylistic demands with serious and necessary humane policy aims. And Bernie synthesized and transcended both problems. This is profoundly bold and necessary. What he's doing is demilitarizing the border. That's essential. That's basic human rights. That's basic human decency. Most people still want to have borders and live in nation states. That is absolutely the world as it is. We're not going to contest that. That's the bad frame. But a very important frame is we are going to demilitarize the border. We are going to have a humane border. We are not going to savage and terrorize human beings. We are going to uphold our obligations under international law. He is doing all of the things that all of them have committed to that are important, such as citizenship for DACA and so on. This is important, but this is standard. However, what he does that's more is actually dismantle ICE and actually dismantle the CPB. No other candidate has put that on the table. And this is an essential, not reform, but dismantling. These are fundamentally parasitic, racist, terrorist organizations in their center, in their core. They can't be reformed. They have to go. He also talks about dismantling the entire new deportation and center and detention. I would obviously say concentration camps, reuniting families. Then there's a specific section on refugees dealing with the climate crisis. That's an acknowledgement of new global realities. Worker and labor protections for those inside the immigration system, vital and connected. Putting the real enemy at the front of the page, which is, of course, capital, not worker to worker. And then also actual whistleblower protections for workers exposing abuses, even if they are undocumented. This is a profoundly powerful step in the right direction. As all these other people, Bernie's cast some bad votes, made some mistakes. In his case, it reflects the fact, I'm sorry, we'll be real, the guy can't hold on his shoulders the entirety of resisting every single prevailing political custom for decades. Okay? Yes, he's made some mistakes. He also, and I think we need to be increasingly real about this, is frankly a remarkable political figure and is an absolutely unique proposition to being elected president. And if you're remotely serious about a left agenda, there's obviously the time has been to stop fucking around for a while, but I think this really underlines it. Then, in addition to that, of course, he's also talking about all sorts of other, basic areas for DACA families and so on. So this is, and importantly in this, he has a specific section where he talks about U.S. foreign policy and destabilization in Latin America and the hemisphere. So this is an integrated plan. It synthesizes so-called immigration reform with foreign policy, with labor, with wages, and with a whole broader set of protections and climate. That's how you do it. Bernie Sanders, as always, keeps bringing it. Let's be real and let's get to the pitch. First of all, guys, I would definitely recommend you snag your tickets to the Michael Brooks Show Live in Philadelphia. That is November 23rd. The guests are Crystal Ball, Artesia Balthrop, and Emma Vigeland. The location is World Cafe, and we literally only have a handful of tickets left. I actually don't even, go check. We're definitely going to be selling this one out. And I actually just did a request. We expanded the amount of people who can do the so-called VIP one because we have already exceeded that. So we've kept that a little bit open to meet demand. So grab your tickets today. Then, in addition to that, of course, become a patron. That's the way this show happens. That's the most important thing you can do. Thank you to everybody who got us over our first 3,000 patrons. We're honored. We appreciate you. And we're profoundly dedicated to our work. As I say, this show played small, but an actual role in what's been happening with freeing Lula, as an example. And all of the other things we're encouraging. So I'm immensely proud of it, and it exists because of you. So join us at patreon.com/TMBS, patreon.com/TMBS. And what else? There's a couple of other things I need to mention. I want to thank everybody that saw us at Yale the other night. That was a lot of fun, rallying Yale for Bernie. It was fun and meaningful, maybe a little ironic, and awesome. I also want to thank the gentleman who brought me that homemade Brazilian pen. That was an amazing gift, and I appreciate it immensely. On November 22nd, I'm moderating a panel with Crystal Ball and Matt Karp at the Verso Loft for the Jacobin magazine. Who's afraid of Bernie Sanders? Come see us, and then see us at the live show November 23rd, World Cafe in Philadelphia. Patreon.com/TMBS is how you become a member. That's the most important thing to do. And we are going to take a brief break. And the man himself who's going to defeat Nancy Pelosi has just entered our room. Shahid Buttar. We will be right back on the Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. It's an honor and privilege to welcome to the studio Shahid Buttar. He is running against Nancy Pelosi.
Thanks so much for having me on,
Have some
Michael.
great leadership in Congress. How's it going?
Amazing. I'm excited. It's never a dull moment. Been on the East Coast for all of 3 days, and it's just one opportunity after another. I'm excited to be on the road collecting more support. I'm looking forward to liberating the seat and representing San Francisco and
I
Washington.
like that. I like liberating the seat. We should actually say tomorrow night, 6:30, at Catch Astoria.
That's right.
In Queens, I'm going to be emceeing an event that you can come, you can meet Shahid, and it's a fundraiser. It's but it's a fundraiser of the people, and it's jam packed. Peter Dow's going to be there.
I hope.
I don't want to. Oh, okay. I think he might be there.
Yeah, he's still working out his travel schedule, but Nomika Constance.
Nomiki Constance is going to be there. We, of course, friend of show.
Yeah.
And
Katie Halper is going to come.
Katie Halper, friend of show, and me. Just let's not bury the image. I mean, come on, man. So I wanted to ask you. Well, actually, first of all, let's just talk about the coup in Bolivia.
Yeah.
As somebody who would be in Congress, obviously, and I want to draw a really helpful, hopefully a distinction here. I'm not an isolationist. I did not want the United States. I mean, some people got very literalistic. They said, "Oh, what do you want the United States to bomb Brazil to liberate Lula?" No, I did not want that to happen. Yeah. What I would like is diplomatic action in a post-imperial order.
Yes.
That is in accordance with solidarity, democratic values, whatever. And a lot of that, I think we don't even know what that looks like yet, because we would have to literally disassemble what our foreign policy is. But I don't want to just say, okay, we don't go out there, fuck the rest of the world. Yeah. That's not. I'm interested in a global project to the extent that that's possible. So there's no
Perhaps
contradiction.
one to uplift human rights rather than suppress them.
I mean, as maybe that might be something we could do. So when you look at that, how do you fit your thinking on foreign policy in terms of how you respond to this coup in Bolivia?
So the first thing I would say with respect to the coup in Bolivia is I'm very eager to learn the full history of the U.S. intelligence agency's role in it. And we know, for instance, that in other countries where we've seen democratically elected governors and governments removed in favor of right-wing dictators, I'm thinking particularly of the replacement of Lula in Brazil with Bolsonaro. We know that the CIA is involved in that theater. In Bolivia, it is confusing, certainly, at the moment. I do think that all of the reporting that describes it as a reflection of instability is under-regarding the fact that this is a coup. No one resigns with a gun to their head, and no one resigns. You can't call it a resignation when the reason that you're resigning is because there have been repeated arson attacks targeting your family and all of your supporters. And what it seems like Evo Morales has done is put the health and safety of his constituents above even his own career, which is, frankly, an act of public service even in stepping down. But I do think that the forces that have conspired to remove him have a great deal to answer for it. I'm very curious, again, to learn is done in the background.
And there's still ongoing, and I'm sorry, I apologize, I have to check because of logistics here, but there's ongoing abuses right now.
Yeah.
I mean, there's significant reports of the right-wing forces terrorizing members of the Morales' family. There's an arrest warrant that's been put out for him. This is ongoing. So, what, I guess, I mean, is it right now as simple as you saying as a leader that you understand that it's a coup and you want to know what the U.S. role is?
I think that's a piece of it. I'd like to do more than that. I mean, ultimately, learning the U.S. role is an investigative process, but beyond investigations come accountability. And it's precisely what we haven't seen at the CIA, really at any point in the agency's history. This is an agency that missed the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is an agency that trained Al-Qaeda. This is an agency that sparked the war on drugs, not to say the challenge to stop them, but brought drugs to the United States to fund its rogue foreign policy and create a system of mass incarceration. The Criminal Intelligence Agency, the only thing that connects its litany of abuses against human rights is that it repeatedly, the one consistent thing it's done is undermine U.S. national security. And I think that removing democratically elected governments in other countries, particularly, and I'm hinging this because I don't know what's coming next yet, right? What is next is still unclear. But if the figure who emerges in Bolivia in the wake of Evo Morales' removal is anything like Bolsonaro in Brazil, it will only increase my suspicions, frankly, of U.S. involvement, and because it would fit the pattern of
and
U.S.
there's lithium reserves there. There's natural gas reserve. I mean, this is a very classic U.S. coup.
Yeah.
Classic resource coup, without a doubt.
The one thing
I
that
have to see
differentiates
if I'm going to give people, oh, great. All right. We're all good. I have to give people the behind the third wall here. I'm ordering a car for Professor Richard Wolff because you got to respect the esteemed professor.
Right on.
And there was a huge miscommunication between me, him, and the driver. So that's what I was taking care of.
Glad that got resolved.
Now everything is resolved and excellent. So so is that like the part of the job that's almost like being like a publicly empowered investigative journalist almost?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. My arrest in the Senate in 2015 was around asking questions that no one has asked since and that no one's ever answered. And I do think that for me, one of the motivations driving me to do this, to run for office and to seek an opportunity to serve in Congress, is to have some questions finally answered that no one has been willing to ask. And I see Ilhan Omar and her leveraging of the oversight process to turn screws and ask questions that nobody's asked Reagan-era war criminals, for instance. That's exactly what I want to do in Congress and legislate to fix some of these issues. But I do think the fact that the body has been so entirely asleep at the switch for so long begs that kind of intervention, and just, as you put it, leveraging the office to investigate facts that need to be unearthed.
Would you do something like what really struck me in the process with Lula was that even people that came from very moderate European political parties who would, I'm sure we would have any number of critiques of their domestic politics, they still have enough socialism in them, frankly, that they not only called for Lula's release, a good number of European parliamentarians and former, and relatively high-positioned leaders in Mélenchon in France, who is of the left, but a guy like Martin Schulz in Germany, who's quite moderate. They actually went to visit him in prison. And it always struck me that, if a U.S. frontline politician did that, that would be massive news in Brazil. And that's also what I mean by not a coup or invasion, but I would like to see a congressman visit a political prisoner as an example.
Right.
Would that be the type of thing?
Not just abroad, but even here. We have political prisoners here in the United States. I mean, these are very much the voices of communities that have been long marginalized, and it's exactly those voices that I'm running to represent.
Absolutely. I guess in the spirit of the show, I'd like to add, Leonard Peltier to that list in terms of domestic political prisoners.
He was very briefly a client of mine. I represented Leonard in a parole hearing, and this was 2004 or maybe 2005, and of course he wasn't allowed parole. We sort of knew the outcome of that process at the outset, but the idea of, for me, that was one of the highlights of my legal career, to have a chance to, it wasn't a sustained engagement. It was brief, but I was very grateful for the chance to represent him.
Nancy Pelosi was approving an NSA appropriation at roughly the same time.
That's right.
So just compare and contrast.
How do we contrast these candidates?
Yeah, how do we TikTok these candidates? I love that. I just got to say, can I just editorialize for a second?
Sure, go for it.
Not only does the man not get nervous about a Leonard Peltier question, he's like, oh yeah, I defended him. I think that says everything. Hey, the Tony Blair Institute just recently put out a report on how to govern technology.
Okay.
Sure, it's Tony Blair, and you could say whatever you want to say about Tony Blair. And in some respects, it actually strikes me as disturbing that it is something like the Tony Blair Institute that is at least putting this type of strategic thinking on the line. Now, I didn't buy his conclusions, but representing Silicon Valley, the last time we had the conversation, I kind of asked you the very basic question about being willing to go up against those interests, which you obviously are.
Yeah.
But even more specifically, and with your background in the Electronic Frontier Foundation, what are we talking about? Breaking up monopolies, or is that the wrong model? Are we talking about nationalization, people owning their own data? What is the policy set that we should be thinking about for governing technology in the 21st century?
The first model I would use is the GDPR. That's the Global Data Protection Arrangement that the EU mandated this spring. And there's a similar law that California has passed that hasn't yet become effective, but will at the beginning of the new year. And a couple of the components of this regulatory framework, for me, there's one in particular and then another one that isn't in either of those frameworks that is also really important. So the first is a respect or a requirement for companies to respect the user's right to opt in to data collection. It's the difference between seeking affirmative consent from a user before collecting not just their contact history or their browsing history, but whatever else they might be doing on other platforms. Facebook, for instance, is notorious about violating this right, monitoring what people do when they're not using Facebook or people who haven't ever tried to use Facebook.
It's to improve connectivity.
So they claim.
That's what Mark Zuckerberg says. We have a famous sound drop. We use a lot of that.
That is, in fact, exactly what he says in response to it. Yeah. Well, and clearly that's a canard.
Yeah.
And the other,
he's a canard.
Nice. And in addition to the user's right to opt in, the other discrete reform that would make a big difference here is a mandate for interoperability from one platform to the next. So I experienced this as a political candidate, and you have too, I suspect, if you've ever had too many message platforms where you're trying to find a message that somebody left you, but you can't remember, was it this platform or that platform? And I have my campaign Twitter, my personal Twitter, the Facebook accounts and Instagram accounts. So there's no reason that those accounts can't read messages sent to a central place that would distribute them to all of them. The reason we don't have that service is because companies would always sue any company that attempted to create integrations between them.
Right.
Interoperability would liberate users. It would extend user choice to change platforms. You could defect from Facebook and take your data with you to another social media network. And it is not just the fact of allowing users control of their data and access to it, but providing it in interoperable formats. We have a long, proud history of adversarial interoperability. Any number of hardware platforms, for instance, use interoperable, like power devices, for instance. That's hasn't needed to be an object of mandating in the past, but here, where we do see companies carving users up, denying them access to the data, interoperable data, denying them the opportunity to choose whether their data is collected or not, I think it's entirely appropriate to have mandates for these very baseline levels of user respect.
What about the China dimension of this? Connecting it with foreign policy, it's fascinating. I can't get over this love fest that we played on the show several months ago with Steve Bannon and Thomas Friedman, because they're supposed to represent. Thomas Friedman's a globalizer, and Steve Bannon, I mean, he's that guy's a nationalist who really cares about American jobs. And they both are demonizing China.
They're both fascists, though, aren't they?
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, congressional candidate.
Just saying.
I was burying the
Call
lead
me
on that
crazy.
one.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. And they're both demonizing China, and they're both talking about the U.S. rules-based system. And it seemed, obviously, relations with China are going to be infinitely more complicated for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
But the hypocrisy, look, who cares? Everybody's a hypocrite on some level. That's fine. But functionally, the hypocrisy is not going to work because China is a peer. It's a G2 world. And you can't just say, hey, it was okay when you guys were bootlegging DVDs and we treated you as a giant sweatshop.
Right.
You guys are moving into 5G and have your own competitive social networks. Whoa, that's not acceptable. And then obviously, conversely, we don't want a world where the Amazon and the PRC synchronize global tech governance.
Right.
So when you look at China, and I think specifically also what you'd where you'd represent in Congress geographically, like looking towards the Pacific, how do you connect the technology conversation with bringing some smart thinking about China to Congress?
I look at China as a dystopian example of how tech can be abused. And the social credit system that they've emerged there is sort of like the system that we here in the United States are hurtling towards without a public mandate. At the moment already, for instance, your credit score can impact and undermine what you pay for insurance. And you can see that's one example. It's not so much tethered to online collection, but what you do online can impact any of those things. In China, they've been unapologetic about fusing all the data collection streams and forcing people to bear the costs. For instance, if you're a dissident there, your insurance rates go up. That's like particularly pointed. Here in the United States, we haven't perfected that system of social control, but the reagents are there. The ingredients are all there, and the inclination is there. It's precisely why we need laws to prevent the platforms from becoming overtly coercive. And I do think that we should take some learning from the Chinese example. And a couple other things just to think about here. One, in China, they have a very different relationship between individual rights and the state, and which is to say they don't have a state apparatus set up to ensure individual rights. We used to here. We called them Article 3 courts before the right wing got their hands around them and essentially started stacking them with executive branch veterans, with prosecutors, with justices like Brett Kavanaugh, who know nothing of the meaning of the term justice. And frankly, I think as long as Brett Kavanaugh remains on the federal bench, the bench institutionally loses its legitimacy.
Right.
And none of us should pretend that the courts have any legitimacy when there are criminals on the bench at the highest courts of the land. And I think these are examples of the United States hurtling down a Chinese path towards authoritarianism that we should be both alarmed about and also, I would just say, concerned about beyond the dimensions of tech, because I see the co-optation of our courts as more frankly reflective of the Chinese experience than the emergence of big tech, which is problematic in itself. I just think that a looser vector for social control than the loss of a counter-majoritarian independent institution to counter legislatures in defending individual rights.
When it comes to immigration, now, I mean, first of all, you're a Bernie Sanders supporter, right?
Hell yeah, I am.
Indeed. What about, how impressed were you with his immigration plan?
Very, for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
So one of the things is, for instance, he's far and away the most intersectional candidate I think anybody in this country's ever seen. And to link in his immigration plan worker rights, like there's a component of his plan that addresses the rights not only of migrant workers but also domestic workers, right? And to recognize the inextricability of labor rights to migrant rights, and it recognizes that the functional reason that so many people migrate is to seek opportunity. Right. He also recognizes in his immigration plan the way that calls for comprehensive immigration reform have placed enforcement before human rights in ways that not only undermine immigrant rights, but this is the key, that undermine the rights of U.S. citizens. And Bernie uniquely, by not advancing an enforcement first framework, and just to be clear, all of the corporate Democrats favor an enforcement first framework. They call it comprehensive immigration reform. It is not favorable to communities. Bernie puts communities first. He puts the human right to migrate first. He puts the right to seek an opportunity for one's labor first. And he doesn't fall prey to the demagoguery that enables security theater to undermine the rights of U.S. citizens. And just to unpack a couple ways in which that happened, two in particular come to mind. One, I've done a lot of work over the last 10 years defending immigrant rights in the context of the surveillance net and the apparatus that the FBI knows as NGI. This is the Next Generation Initiative. It was never created pursuant to a statute. It was in fact created in secret. The only reason we know it exists is because a bunch of different immigrant rights groups sued the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice under the Obama administration to discover the secret origins of what was presented publicly as the Secure Communities Initiative. This was a DHS program, or so we thought, that was presented to the public as a fast track to deport immigrants who had committed criminal offenses. And the idea was, if you get booked for a criminal offense, your fingerprints get taken, other biometrics potentially, they get compared to a database, and if you're not a U.S. citizen, you're deported. And that works in theory, except that the people they were fingerprinting or collecting biometrics from weren't just immigrants. So the FBI built a biometric database, including 500 million records, including driver's license photos from departments of motor vehicles, and created a biometric identification scheme, the Next Generation Initiative, using immigrants as political punching bags with an agenda in secret to then expand it well beyond the ranks of immigrants. That's just one example of how migrant rights not only stand in for human rights, but how undermining those rights creates opportunities for our establishment to run roughshod over the rights of American citizens. I could offer another example drawn from the border, but maybe I'll leave it at that. And see.
No, it's fantastic. And I mean, I'll get to that actually in a few minutes before you go, because I want to get to the synthesis of your politics, which are so fascinating to me. They're helpful to me.
Right on. Thanks, brother.
What about, I talk about also bringing a perspective of humanity to the Palestinian people, to Congress.
Yeah. You see in Israel, and I would say that there's so many ways to think about this. Maybe to use the one I was just using, in the same way that restrictions on immigrant rights often create then pathways to undermine the rights of U.S. citizens, U.S. support for Israel has also been used to import particularly paramilitary policing tactics and training into U.S. streets. Every time you see an unarmed American shot dead by a major city police department, it's not unlikely that the Israeli Defense Forces had a hand at some point in training those officers. Among the things that Americans, police officers, I was going to say soldiers, is a Freudian slip, among the things that police officers in the U.S. are often trained to do when they're trained by Israeli soldiers is to shoot until the body stops moving, which is why you hear stories about people getting shot like 30, 40 times. Right. That's not a thing that police used to do. If you shoot somebody, maybe they go down. You don't just keep pumping rounds into them. That is a paramilitary counterinsurgency tactic, not policing. And you can see policing become infected with counterinsurgency thinking, particularly because the U.S. launders our human rights abuses through the Israeli government. And I think of that as just one among many examples in which our support for authoritarianism in other countries, or at least authoritarianism as applied to some populations, unfortunately blows back into the restriction of rights here in the United States.
I have to make this check, but when did you finally decide to take on Pelosi? Yeah.
So I first ran for this office in 2018. So February was when I first started thinking about it. We launched the campaign in March for a June 2018 primary. So I was in the 2018 race for 3 months. In those 3 months, without any media attention, we got as many votes as Ocasio-Cortez did in her primary on the same platform, essentially in the same cycle. I was outspent fairly dramatically by some campaigns that had much longer time in the race than I was, and I beat all of those campaigns on the left. I emerged as the leading challenger to Speaker Pelosi from the left, and I'm back in the 2020 cycle to finish the job. We launched this campaign for the 2020 cycle about 6 months ago, and when we launched then, we already were moving. Our ground game was stronger than it ever got in 2018. We've also, in this cycle, raised vastly more support than we did last year. We're at about 5x already. The dollar amount with 10x the number of donors. We're at $250,000 from over 6,500 people around the country. And I still have a year left to build this campaign, so we're just getting started. There's a great deal of momentum that we've established also in, as we're sitting here, it's sharing views with public audiences with, through media opportunities. Having had a chance to be profiled by The Progressive and Mother Jones and the San Francisco Chronicle and Jacobin and Jewish Currents and Current Affairs, we've reached a much larger body of supporters than we ever did last year. And again, with a year left in front of us, I'm very confident that we'll be able to get the word out and mobilize the support that we need in San Francisco to liberate our city's voice in Washington.
Talk about that synthesis of socialism and the best tradition of constitutional liberty in this country.
Yes, thank you for that. I feel like that's an under-regarded intersection. So many contemporary socialists appropriately recognize that the battle against capital is a largely politically economic one, right? And securing rights to basic human needs, healthcare, housing, food, come to mind. And that's a big part of our struggle as socialists, making sure that to the extent there is private capital, that it serves people instead of people serving private capital. But there's a whole other dimension to democratic socialism that cuts in a different direction, and that is the struggle against authoritarianism. That's the D in democratic socialism. And we are aspiring to a brighter future at the very same time that our baseline democratic norms in the United States are fraying at the seams or falling apart dramatically, you might say. We talked a little bit about this before when I had a chance to speak with you, but I see lots of different compounding, intersecting threats to our democracy. And I think that as democratic socialists, the very first thing we have to do is defend democracy while we seek to promote socialism. And in my mind, that means, among other things, fighting executive secrecy, fighting the surveillance state that silences Americans, fighting for voting rights to make sure that people can participate in the process, and guarding the independence of the courts as the right wing continues to undermine them.
Can you talk briefly about this terrifying FBI report? We talked to Ken Klippenstein about it, about so-called black identity extremists. I think that precisely exemplifies what you're talking about.
It does. I call that COINTELPRO 2.0. So many Americans have forgotten the first one. Yeah, I've had an opportunity in colleges, law schools, even among crowds of people who lived through the COINTELPRO abuses to ask, who remembers COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence programs? And it amazes me for a set of programs that were, when they were exposed, so prolific, how many Americans have just forgotten entirely that for 50 years, the FBI was working aggressively, not just to infiltrate, but to neutralize domestic social groups pursuing baseline civil rights, the end of the war in Vietnam, equal rights for women, rights for Native Americans, independence for Puerto Ricans. Even white supremacists were targeted in COINTELPRO. It didn't even matter what you believed, as long as you believed anything between the 1940s and the late 1970s. Whatever you believed, the FBI was coming after you if the government didn't feel like your vision fit with the established order. And this is in a country with a robust commitment, supposedly, to free speech. We had a First Amendment throughout this process. The laws were written, the words on the paper were there. There just wasn't any meaningful respect for the law. And behind the wall of executive secrecy, surveillance became weaponized. It undermined our democracy. It undermined any number of discrete communities. And just as an example, many people would think of this as a conspiracy theory, and it's horrifying when you realize that we have the documents to prove that the FBI tried to kill Dr. King and drive him to an early death. We have a national holiday and a monument in Washington, D.C. honoring this man that the Bureau tried to take from us. And that was the first time that the FBI criminalized black dissent. And I don't know to what extent it ever stopped, quite frankly, but it certainly is alive and well today. The Bureau actively criminalizes what it calls black identity extremism, and it characterizes black identity extremism as the articulation of equal rights for people and the right not to be shot dead arbitrarily by a cop. And the idea that that makes somebody, I mean, I'm a black identity extremist by that definition. You probably are too.
I mean, literally. I want to like really be clear that you're not being flippant at all. It would be, and I'll be 100% clear. I totally err on, I am, one way in which I'm not trendy is I totally err on the side of, regardless, even if it is the worst, most toxic, disgusting ideology, you do not want to encourage government surveillance unless you're talking about a literal security threat. I don't want the FBI all over the ass of even the worst people in the society. That's not how I want to solve problems. I am with you on the civil libertarian tip. But just to be really clear, to underline what you're saying, they are not saying something, and this would also be utterly ridiculous and need to be fought. But when they say that, they're not saying like, oh, we're harassing some, I don't know, black Israelites or whatever, which would, again, I have to reiterate, would be absurd and disgusting and also should be rejected. But they are literally saying that black identity extremism is, essentially, is a anti-police violence agenda, is a pro-civil rights equity agenda, which in fact absolutely would apply to our politics because we don't want police murdering people of color randomly, or anybody for that matter, randomly.
Right.
That's how they're defining it. And that's their writing.
And it's interesting to me that their construction of extremists extend beyond people who share black identity, right? The fact that our movements for justice are intersectional means that the people that are marginalized by this designation by the Bureau are people of all stripes, white folks, brown folks, all the people who have stood in favor of basic due process principles, according to the FBI, are extremists. We are simply standing in line with our stated commitments in our Constitution and our laws. The extremists here are the government agencies that would allow state violence with impunity, the judges who turn a blind eye, and frankly, the policymakers who are unfortunately complicit in allowing violence, state violence, lethal state violence with impunity.
How are all the ways we can help you?
I appreciate that question. A bunch of different ways. So shouting us out online certainly helps. Folks can find us online at Shahid for Change or shahidforchange.us. Contributions certainly help. Speaker Pelosi is the most well-funded corporate fundraiser in the Democratic Party. I am an immigrant with no family legacy. The whole fact that I'm even...
what's the web address? Sorry, we're just putting this up.
No, you got it. Shahidforchange.us. Yeah. There it is. And the idea that I'm even in a position to contend this seat, frankly, to me is very humbling. And I'm very grateful to the support of the 6,500 people around the country who have pooled their resources to challenge the speaker and recognize in our campaign a long overdue voice to represent San Francisco's values. Anybody, anywhere can sign up to volunteer.
Folks are supporting our campaign from coast to coast with projects from data entry and social media support to graphic design, video production, phone banking. There's a million ways to help our campaign, whether you live in San Francisco or whether you live in Brooklyn. And
awesome. And tomorrow night,
join us at
Cafeteria.
Cafeteria.
Come on, join us. You got to see. We got to see you there. And again, Nancy Pelosi has directly said that she is going to fight Medicare for all. So there is no. I mean, it's fun to get the crown of the corporate establishment, and it's an important race. But this is somebody who has already made clear she's not going to triangulate back if there is a progressive wave.
She wants to impose the pay-go rules on the next administration.
And that means no left agenda. And incidentally, the next wave of no left agenda is what they've done to the courts. And Shahid is one of the only people thinking strategically about that. A lot more of us need to, frankly, follow him in that. So I really want to underline that this is an immensely important race beyond the obvious schadenfreude of defeating somebody like Nancy Pelosi.
Right.
Or obviously also shouts to Michaela Wilkes taking on Steny Hoyer. You two with replacements would be incredible. If you win at your inaugural, well, first of all,
I'll say when, but I appreciate the question.
Excuse me. When you win, I love it. When you win, expect an invite for everybody in the crew
Appreciate
to the party and swearing in.
Right on.
And we invite Chronix to come perform.
I'll sound with that. That sounds fascinating. Yes.
Vote for him. Help him out. This is really important. You need an army behind. I mean, look, Bernie Sanders elected president. Amazing. It's going to be even more work to fight for the agenda when he wins. We go back to sleep. Some other Democrat is president. You need someone to keep fighting for this actual future we need. Fucking nightmare. Donald Trump is reelected. You can't have Nancy Pelosi saying, I just got off with Bob and he represents a swing state in New Jersey, so we're actually going to open up a new concentration camp in the middle of Manhattan. But don't worry, I'll say Trump is stupid on TV. We need actual leadership here.
Resistance for real, not just a hashtag. Right?
Precisely.
You can have Shahid come in and say, actually, I was just looking through these CIA files on what we're doing in Bolivia, and guys, come on.
Yes.
Knock this off.
If I can press that, there's
please.
a reason that Snowden is in exile while Daniel Ellsberg is an international hero. And the difference precisely is that there was a Mike Gravel in the Senate to take Ellsberg's findings and read them into the record and champion truth and transparency. And Snowden had no Gravel. There was nobody in Congress when Snowden came forward who was willing to fight the establishment and guard the truth. And that's why I'm going in there, because we need guardians of the people in the Constitution and Congress. It's why the body's there. And frankly, if we are to fight these battles, I want to make sure that I'm in a position to do everything I can to defend my neighbors. That's why I'm running for this seat.
We got to get you elected to Congress.
You're kind, brother. We're all in this together, not me, us.
Absolutely. Oh, well, we need to get me to 5,000 patrons. So I agree.
There you go.
Yeah, no, we all have goals. I was just emphasizing one of them. Shahid,
so good to be with
thank you so much. Please, everybody, incredibly important race and definitely part of this wider movement. Shahid Buttar.
Thanks for having me, brother.
All right, guys, we're going to take a brief break, and we'll be right back with the Gem and Professor Richard Wolff. Thanks, everybody. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Jam-packed evening. Joining us now is the legend himself. Pleasure to have him back, Professor Richard Wolff. Thank you, Professor Wolff, for returning.
Glad to be here.
How are you?
Tired.
Oh, well, we'll energize. Well, let me. You know what we could do is let's take a.
Sorry. That shows you how tired I am.
Oh my gosh. We'll start. You know what we're gonna do? We're going to start, because you know I always like to do this because I'm an instigator. We're going to do a brief gem segment with David Griscom, and then you will give your review and see if he's improved. Let's get started.
He did well last time. So.
Well, you've graded him very generously. What you say off mic is much sharper. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, you know, I just want to take a second and really shout out Shama Sawant for
Yes.
her victory in Amazon. I mean, that was an absolutely huge victory, not just for the people of Seattle, but really to show Amazon that they're not going to be able to push around our democracy. And, you know, we're seeing this is going to be more and more of the chapter of the next few years. Tech controls our data, our online experience, and more they're fighting to take control of our democracy. And what we're seeing now, they're also trying to take control of our cities. Let us not forget the fact that what Amazon was trying to fight against when it came to Sawant and the City Council of Seattle was trying to prevent them from being able to build homeless shelters in the city that desperately needs it because of the unequal system that in large parts companies like Amazon have created there. Now we're also seeing in Toronto, Sidewalk Labs, which is owned by Google, is planning to build the first smart city. And this is going to be a city that's going to have, it's an area of Toronto, it's their waterfront district, that's going to have cameras everywhere. It's going to track everyone's movements and get immense amounts of personal and private data of individuals in order to create an efficient city. right? So we're seeing this, and it's absolutely frightening when you realize the data practices of these corporations, that these are people are being invited into our city planning. Now, there's a housing crisis all across the country as well. And we've seen recently in the past few months that Facebook, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft have all pledged money in some way to help the housing crisis. Now, there's some things that could possibly be good from this, but what we're seeing is that, for example, Facebook is, promising to subsidize some rents. They're going to open up their land to be able to create affordable housing, the terms of which are not very clear yet. And what we're going to be seeing is that, do we want a corporation like Facebook to be able to decide what people's rents are subsidized and which ones aren't? It's the dual role of these corporations that own so much land in these areas that they want to be able to have some base of workers, but they also want to make sure that the land holdings that they have increase in value. So when we're talking about a corporation like Facebook or Apple subsidizing housing costs, that actually won't do much to keep rents in the surrounding area lower. It will just allow them to have some workers on their properties, be able to afford to live there. So this is a big question that we're going to have to deal with. And let's also not forget the fact that so much of our rental units in the United States are owned by a few massive real estate holding corporations that their number one goal is to extract profits, to give in large part to a lot of international bourgeoisie who are trying to park their money in the United States housing market because it has such high returns and is continuing to grow and become more and more exploitative for the average worker who, across the board, Americans are rent burdened and they can't afford to live anywhere in the United States on an average working class salary. So we absolutely need national rent control, and we need to embolden cities to go further. We need investment in beautiful green public housing across the country. We need to tax empty units and not allow people to hold empty apartment units in cities that desperately need housing.
That would really interfere with money laundering, David.
That's very true.
A little bit fair.
Yeah. And we absolutely, we need to break up as we move to decommodifying housing in general, these massive real estate corporations that are able to hold such outsized power and influence over our lives. We need to modernize our cities. People are faced with two choices. One is going to be dominated by tech interests, the financial elite, and a few rich billionaires, and the other could be a radical, democratic, socialist future that ensures that every single person is able to house themselves and live in their communities and live in the places that they work.
Terrific. Well, an A from me, David. But Professor Wolff?
Same.
Wow. That's a breakthrough.
Can I add a couple things?
Yes, please.
Well, the old joke about socialists wanting the government to plan things. It's not the kind of socialism that makes sense to me, but I understand it. For a long time it was. That's what socialism meant. And just imagine if you had allowed socialist government planning. You understood that the population was growing at a certain rate, that it was moving around the country because of where industry was located. And you made a decision to build, imagine this, ahead of the need, to make sure that you built housing where people and jobs were going. If one part of the country was losing population, losing jobs, and people were moving, well, you would build housing, again, imagine it, ahead, so that as the people got needy, you had an apartment. We don't do that in the United States. We rely on the market. But I can tell you about a country famous for building apartments ahead of the need. It's called the People's Republic of China. And regularly the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal make fun of the fact that they have big blocks of apartments that are empty, whole cities that are unoccupied. Ha ha, see how crazy they are? No, they're not. They're planning ahead, which they can do with their system, and we can't. And the result is we have people who can't afford it. We have the lunatic arrangement of wealthy people gentrifying, and then discovering that the people they want to take out the dog and clean the thing and be the nanny have to travel 2 hours from some place where they can afford, which makes no sense and is inefficient. The market is inefficient. Capitalist markets have always been inefficient, except for the professors who pretend that it is efficient. The joke is that the Chinese building ahead It's a much saner arrangement, gives people a lot of work, and avoids 90% of the chaotic way that we do it. Capitalism, a history of urban slums coexisting with wildly rich mansion. There's no planning. There's nothing remotely like equity. And we're just seeing the latest phase of it with this. You can't have housing unless that's your goal, that's your project, and you want to give people a way to live. You have to then coordinate two things. It's not rocket science. The people have to earn enough money, and the prices of housing have to be such that they'll have enough money to buy the house. A system that can't do that is not an efficient system. Ours isn't, because we have a disconnect between the prices of the housing and the incomes of most of the people, producing the absurdity of homelessness alongside of empty apartments all over the country. You could not have a more staggering condemnation of how capitalism handles the housing problem than that.
Do you remember when Jeremy Corbyn caused a big stir by suggesting that there was a mismatch between the homelessness crisis in London and people's second homes and apartments that they don't even occupy?
Right.
And that was considered to be a great scandal that he actually suggested. Looks like there's a need. Looks like there's a meeting of the need.
Right.
And they said he was Stalin. Actually, Boris Johnson compared him to Stalin just the other day.
Let alone is it surprising that cities like London, New York, and San Francisco that are very tied into the international finance market are the ones that really face like the worst of this inequity when it comes to housing.
Right.
It's famous if you talk to your realtors in Manhattan. Once it's dark, if you walk along Fifth Avenue, say from in the 30s all the way down to Washington Square Park, you will see that the overwhelming majority on any given day of windows are dark. There's nobody in there. And if you go in and you talk to the doorman that sits in the front of many of these buildings, they will gladly, just chat with you. You're a reporter or something. They will tell you, this apartment, this is owned by somebody in make up a country, and he's very wealthy, and he keeps this apartment. And 2 or 3 times a year, his nieces or his uncle or his wife come to New York for a lovely week of shopping. And how fun it is that they stay in their apartment during that week. And then several months go by and somebody else. That's it. That's what these apartments are. And, there's no... It's like, I remember I went to school at Yale in New Haven, and they had a homeless problem. And I once made a proposal for 6 months out of the year, at least. All the Yale dorms are empty. Huge collection of beautifully prepared apartments, often empty because the students take their stuff home at the end of the year or the summer. You could do all kinds of creative things. The Yale people were beside themselves. Just the idea that they should share something. That's what you say on Sunday at the chapel. Right. It's not what you do.
Do you think that myth of capitalist efficiency is waning? In other words, there's the raw power of capital, which is as powerful as ever. But the broad, we talked about Gramsci a couple months ago, and I've talked about it, but the hegemony, the actual belief in it, the discourse of it is loosening and weakening a bit.
Yeah. But as an idea, efficiency, and every time I try to explain this, I lose a few people, so I got to be careful here. The idea of efficiency is itself absurd.
Right.
Let me try to explain. In economics, we teach, and I have had to do that in my life, biting my tongue at every stage, but I had to teach something called cost-benefit analysis, which is really the same thing. You assess the efficiency of some proposed project, adding a wing to the hospital, rerouting the highway over there, investing in this, whatever. And you're supposed to then look at all the positive things that will come out of it and all the negative ones. And then you measure the positive ones and you measure the negative ones. And if the positive outweigh the negative, well, it's a go. Because that's efficient. It's got more positives than negatives. And if you're comparing two alternatives, same game. You compare the net positives in the one against the other, and you go with whichever the net positive is bigger, right? It's a nice rule. Students can take notes and vomit it all back on the exam. But that's what we call education, and so that's what we do. But I'm a mathematician. Before I did economics, I did mathematics. So let me tell you what's wrong with this lovely story. Number one, all the positive effects, first problem, many of them don't show up for time, for a month, for a year. Therefore, unless you can read the future, which nobody can, you don't know what the positives are. You have no way to identify them, let alone measure them. And the same applies to the negatives. So the project of counting them all up, that's a fantasy. You can't do that. Nobody can do that because they're in the future, which we're not at yet. So the idea is nuts, number one. But that's only half. Here comes the second nuts. The second nut's even worse than the first one.
Yes.
We identify a positive outcome, problem. We know the outcome, but we can't allocate the causality of that outcome to only the thing we're measuring. In other words, the outcome of building a thing over there is X. But X was caused by 50,000 other things, which we don't know. We're all playing a role. The temperature was different. The winds were different. This person, car veered off. You can't do it because the things you're measuring are not the products only of what you're measuring. So not only can't you get the pluses and minuses, but you can't isolate how much of what you're looking at was the cause versus other things that you're not including. When you put it all together, you can't measure the positives or the negatives. Therefore, subtracting an unknowable number from another unknowable number puts you in the land of cuckoo. There is no such, the efficiency of something is unknown. The only reason this idea was developed was that people had an anxiety. And here's the anxiety. We have to make a decision. Are we going to build that hospital wing or not? Are we going to reroute the highway or not? Are we going to I understand. The decision has to be made. And the anxiety was, oh my God, I have a little bit of information, but I may make a wrong decision. And then I'll be in the soup. So what I need is a metric that I can point to and that everybody will recognize is valid to say, see, I did my homework, I looked at the efficiency calculus, and it said go. So don't get angry at me. It's fakery. It's total fakery.
Is this the Freud part of Marx plus Freud equals truth?
It's more than mathematics.
No, but I'm talking about the anxiety.
Yes.
The anxiety part that says, okay, yes. I just have to actually make a decision, but I need to create a story to mask my anxiety and have an escape route. Does that idea
it's
get
like
even...
you're right. It is psychological because think of it. Am I going to go out with her? Is it going to work out? The answer is you don't know. You don't. You make a reasonable guess, but then you go and we all do it. Well, if I cross the street, will a truck hit me? Well, it might, but But to say to me, I know I can cross the street because I've done it, that's it. Allies your anxiety because you know there's a risk.
Right.
Look, it is. It's religious. You know what it is? It's that when my body dies, no, that's too scary. I don't die. A part of me takes off. It's called my soul. It goes right upstairs, and it sits with the angels next to God's left hand. Okay, this allies anxiety. It has nothing to do with anything other than it's the little child in us. It's the little 2-year-old who, before he or she goes to sleep, wants mommy or daddy to read them a story. The details of the story are not what's important, whether the piggies got blown away by the wolf or not. It's an allying of anxiety. It's mommy being there with that beautiful voice putting you to sleep, or daddy telling you a story, the details of which you could care less. It's the event. It's the cathartic allocation of, how should I put it, peacefulness that you need, because the world is scary in this moment.
That's the phrase we always use, Matt. We always say
bedtime stories.
We always say that's a bedtime story.
Yes.
We use that all the time on the show.
That's what they all are. They're all bedtime stories.
And does that bedtime story get even more dangerous when you're doing a cost-benefit analysis that says the entire global ecosystem is an externality?
That's right. Crazy. And then, and that you could get away with that, I mean, it's just, I drove my car into your driveway. That I happened to run over you in the process. It's an externality. I was interested in getting my car in the garage. I'm really sorry this happened to you. I got nothing to do with this. Look at me. I'm as innocent as a newborn. I'm aiming my car in the garage. Why you happen to be lying there eating a sandwich? I said, no, nothing to do with me.
Can you tell us about just big, so take it in any direction you want. We talked about the People's Republic of China last time, and now I'd like to talk about the Soviet Union. How do we understand that story? And literally, I know that that's a massive amount of human history, and so please, really, any direction.
Well, it's hard for me, since I'm asked these kinds of questions all the time.
But better by me.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's hard to know where to start. Let me start.
Can we start with Lenin, maybe? Or start where you want.
Here's the thing that has to be remembered. Socialism doesn't really start until the early part of the 19th century. There is nothing really like that before. You have the Chartism in England, the movements like that, and then you develop this language, socialism, just kind of awkward, and communism, out of the word social and community and all that. So it doesn't really get going until the 19th century. And it goes very fast after that. It's amazing how fast it went, and it goes global very quickly. It's one of the most incredible stories of the speed with you can see that it must have been speaking to something in the human experience that's extraordinary to go from an isolated case of England and Germany and a few other places early in the 19th century and then just go global. I mean,
everywhere on Earth.
Yeah, like capitalism,
Right.
because socialism is capitalism's shadow. You can no more get rid of socialism than you can get rid of your shadow. As soon as the light shines, you got it. When you turn the light off, you may imagine it's disappeared. It's right there, just waiting for you to turn the light on.
Was that the Hegel of it? That's the
exactly.
antithesis is always there?
Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is the only time socialists got beyond developing a critique of capitalism, which they did from the beginning, the only time before Russia was the few weeks in 1870 in the city of Paris. There was an uprising. Marx's own writings were part of it. His friends and associates were active in it. And for a few weeks, that's all it was. A few weeks, the working class of Paris kind of made a little revolution just in the city and took over. And they created something called the Paris Commune, which lasted a few weeks and then was ruthlessly crushed by the French army. But that was it. Before that, there was no taking over that lasted at all. You had a little spark here or there. You had a little revolution. Really shouldn't have been called that in 1905 in Russia. But 1917 is absolutely revolutionary in the history of the world. It's the first experiment in which socialists, largely as a matter of luck, were able, in the confused chaos of a society falling apart, feudal Russia, early capitalist Russia, having just lost World War I, the Tsar humiliated beyond recoup, in the chaos of a collapsed war effort, in the chaos of a very poor country to begin with a decapitated government, this small socialist party, which is what it was called, they didn't have that name, communism, then, takes power. And it now has to do something with absolutely no precedent. I mean, no other country had done this. No other country had any history. You could see, well, they tried this, it didn't work, and they had none of that. They had the Paris Commune. And if you know much about Lenin, he wrote a number of very important pamphlets in the years leading up to the Russian Revolution about the Paris Commune and what lessons should be done. They were acute. This was the one thing they could think about that gave them some clues. The reason I say it is this is the first experiment. To imagine that they would have somehow had the roadmap, the way to do it right, to succeed, to build, to grow without making one screw up after another, that's absurd. It takes a long time to learn how to rebuild a society. This was the first effort. And arguably the only other place that's big and complex to try it is China. Because the others were little countries, very different situation. Russia's the biggest country by geography on this planet, and China's the biggest country by population. These are real big experiments. And the Chinese are only the second. Second point. Capitalism did not jump out of feudalism, all done. One experiment, got it right. There were hundreds of efforts to set up capital in cities and towns across Europe. They often didn't last more than a week or a month, sometimes a year, and then they fell apart. And people studied that to try with the next falling apart of feudalism or the next uprising of serfs who wanted to get rid of it. Could they put things together so that they would work? So my first is, when I read literature on the Soviet Union, I very rarely come across a sensitivity to what in the world did you expect? This ragtag bunch of smart guys, I get that.
Smart guys.
Smart.
Very smart guys. They did a tremendous job.
Stalin, Trotsky, Lenin, all of them. And one of the reasons Russia had such terrible problems, they wiped all those people out, all those early Bolsheviks who had spent a lifetime trying to figure this out. So that's the first thing. Give them some slack. This is an experiment. It lasted 70 years. Pretty good. Pretty good for an early experiment. I would have expected them to last. Well, let me give you an example. People don't know this, but in 1917, 18, 19, there were other revolutions in Europe, not just in Russia. There was a revolution, to give you an example, in Hungary. Mm-hmm. And they set up the Hungarian Soviet Socialist Republic. They formed that. And they had a leader, a Lenin-type leader named Bela Kun, K-U-N. In Munich, can you imagine, Southern Catholic Germany, they did it as well. Kurt Eisner, in Southern Catholic Germany, a Jew becomes the leader of the Bavarians, what they call it, because that's part of Germany's Bavaria, Bavarian Soviet Socialist. They took the names. They lasted weeks and months because they could not manage it. They were also experiments. They fell by the wayside. The Russian one, for a lot of peculiar reasons, lasted 70 years. And what did it accomplish? And then we'll talk about the horrors of it, because they had those too.
Right.
But first, the accomplishment. I don't know how to say this with enough intensity to get it across. But
I'm sure you can.
I'm going to try.
I'm confident in you, Professor Wolff. You
In
always bring the heat.
In 1917, time of the revolution, Russia is the most backward country in Europe. The vast majority of its people are illiterate. They live in the countryside with an agriculture that's 150 years behind the rest of Europe. You could not have a more extreme example of underdevelopment, okay, in 1917. They have just gone through a world war which they lost. Right. Immediately following the revolution, they have a civil war between a white and red army. The Civil War is intervened or interfered with by the West, which tries to crush the new government. 4 countries send troops: Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. 10,000 troops of American troops are landed in Russia to help the White Army defeat the new government. Just a footnote.
And by the way, the White Army engages in some of the most vicious pogroms and mass killings imaginable.
Right. But just for the record.
Yes.
Did the Soviet Union ever send troops that entered the United States? Answer, no.
Oh, really? So I saw Red Dawn, so I'm a little confused by this.
Did the United States ever land its troops on Soviet territory? Yes. Who's got a right to be afraid of whom in this complicated relationship? Think about it for a minute. Anyway, they went from the poorest of what? Civil War, foreign invasion, lost World War I. 10 years later, they engaged in collectivization of agriculture, another trauma for the society. That's in the early 30s. And then in the early 40s, they have a war with Hitler that kills 40 to 50 million Russians because it's fought on the Russian territory because the Germans invaded and went all the way to Moscow, as you know. Okay, unbelievable destruction, unbelievable chaos, unbelievable poverty. By 1970, they're the second most important political and economic power in the world. It's an unbelievable, achievement. It's just, in the annals of economic development, there's nothing like it until the 21st century, and this is going to be difficult for some people to hear, when the only other example of economic growth like that is the People's Republic of China. This is not an endorsement of China or an endorsement of the Soviet Union, but to pretend that what I just said didn't happen is an act of dishonest denial that I find mind-bending. They set out to stop being a poor country and become a wealthy country. They did it. The Chinese have done exactly the same, not the same way, but the same goals, and they did it. And the rest of the world pays a lot of attention, since most of the rest of the world wants to do that too and hasn't been able to. Right, now the third part. Did they kill people in the collectivization of agriculture? Sure they did. Did the Chinese kill people in the struggles after the Great Leap Forward? Yeah, they did. I'm not particularly taken by history written according to how many dead bodies there were. I don't find that a terribly useful metric. But apparently people who don't like the Soviet Union and China, they really love it. So they like to repeat that Stalin was a murderer and Mao also. There's truth to that. There were terrible struggles. And a lot of people died, either by military activity or in the byproduct, as usual, the civilians that died. Okay, let's face that. Was that good? No. Is that a flaw of the system? Yeah. Did they manage their affairs in a way that caused all these deaths that they shouldn't have? Yeah, probably. But if we're going to use that metric, okay, then let's do it. Stupid in my mind, but let's do it.
Well, explain, though. I think I understand, but a lot of people hearing won't understand why. Why is it that stupid? Why is that a stupid metric?
Because if you're going to identify deaths during the period of Stalin's government or Mao's, and you want to make a critique of the Soviet Union or a critique of socialism, which is usually what's being done, see socialism, sort of like recently socialism, see Venezuela, so
right.
as if you've captured it. Well, then you would have to have as the balancer, what deaths could you attribute in the same way to capitalism? If we're going to do history by body count, let's go. And I'm going to do that now, just so you see how stupid this way of thinking is. Right. In the 20th century, there were two world wars, World War I, World War II. They're the worst wars in the history of the human race. Reasonably estimating at least 100 million people were killed in those two wars, even by the usual historical metric. So if you're going to measure a system's worthwhileness by the deaths during its period of dominance and power, socialism is a piker by comparison to capitalism, just in those two wars. But I'm not done. Capitalism also is responsible for modern colonial imperialism. I mean, why were millions of Africans ripped out of their society, setting back that continent, I don't know, 100, 200, 300 years, we're still looking at the results, was for slavery. And slaves were picked up in order to make profit off of sugar and profit off of cotton. And that's what they were brought. They were wrapped up in a capitalist system, making a lot of money, but needing laborers, and Africans were unfortunately targeted to do it. The damage done is beyond words. The first book I ever published, my doctoral dissertation, was an analysis of British colonialism in Africa, in the country of Kenya. In those days it was called the East Africa Protectorate. The British arrived in 1895 And they did a census. They often did that. There were 4 million, well, that's what there were, 4 million Africans living in what we now call Kenya. In 1930, they did another census. And by the way, this is my own research in the British Museum and the Colonial Library in London, which the Rockefeller brothers paid for.
Do you need more water?
If you could, yeah,
please, somebody more water for Professor Wolff.
Okay. So the census in 1930, you ready? 2.5 million people. Okay. After 30 years of British colonialism, in this one little corner, they had decimated the population, driving it from 4 million, their count, to 2.5 million, their count.
Right.
Now you multiply that by all the different countries wrapped up in the wrapped up in the colonial experience, the British colonialism in Asia, in India, in what we now call Pakistan, in Africa. I mean, the numbers, they're astronomical. They go into the many, many million. If you're going to count bodies, what are you doing? Now,
what's a smarter metric than just counting bodies?
What happens to the society? What happens to its institutions, to the communities that are set up, to their culture, to their political ways of functioning? If you want to count people that are sick or dead, okay. I mean, I'm not against it, but making this story. I mean, I was in a debate 3 nights ago. When was it? Tuesday of last week, a bit more. Can I say the name of the debate? Is that okay?
Oh, it depends.
Soho
just
debates.
Kidding. Of course, say the name of the debate. Are you kidding me?
It's a libertarian group.
Oh. You went in. We'll Stalin will erase it out of the sound later.
I made roughly this argument critical of because he had said Stalin killed people and socialism kills people, and I did this metric, and he you could see he was a little bit discomforted. My debating opponent, he said yes, but the Russians killed their own. I thought this was a marvelous moment. In other words, killing your own is bad. Killing other people, not so bad. Extraordinary morality, put it aside. So I reminded him of the Civil War. What did we do? The worst war in American history is the Civil War. We killed more of each other in the Civil War than we did in World Wars I and II. What are you going to do with this history? We were in a struggle in the Civil War, we say. We had capitalism and we had slavery, and it was a war to extinguish one economic system, slavery, because it was held to be incompatible with the morality and the values of the other system. That's exactly what Stalin said. We are in a war with capitalism. We have to protect ourselves against socialism, and we're going to go to war. We're not going to roll over for these people. Are not going to reestablish capitalism here in the. Put aside whether it's right or wrong. These are the arguments that are made, and there's a peculiar, almost amnesia involved in imagining that the socialists have some monopoly or some extraordinary responsibility for killing that capitalism didn't or doesn't have. I find that bizarre, that kind of thinking.
Right. So the question is how do we actually synthesize those things and tell the whole story, not minimize any? The crimes are all around.
That's right.
We have to account for all of them. Will you spend a little bit of time with us in the postgame?
Absolutely.
Terrific. Have we been energizing you?
Yes.
Fantastic. Will you tell us a little bit of? Can we talk in the postgame? I want to talk a little bit about Corbyn and Labor because they're in elections and that's incredibly important. And I would like to touch a little lesson on the 18th Brumaire. Think we could do that?
Sure.
Fantastic. All right, guys. We have a lot. And, of course, we'll also have a debunk with Professor Ben Burgess, who was recently a guest on your fantastic show, Economic Update, as was I.
Yes, you were.
Very proud to make my debut. Guys, later this week, I'm going to be in L.A. I'm going to co-host the Damage Report on Thursday. On Friday, I think, I'll be on the Young Turks and doing some other stuff out there. Become a patron today. Thank you to our first over 3,000 patrons. Join patreon.com/TMBS. See you in Philadelphia for the live show at Crystal Ball, Artesia Balthrop, and Emma Vigeland at November 23rd at World Cafe. November 22nd, I'm moderating a Jacobin panel with Crystal Ball and Matt Karp called Who is Afraid of Bernie Sanders? And listen, I'm very proud, obviously, of the incredible work with Professor Wolff and the recent interviews with Adolph Reed. Please make sure you get that. And it's still behind a paywall. The conversation with Slavoj Žižek was fantastic. He allowed me to interrupt him. Professor Wolff, tell us all the ways that people can connect with your unparalleled work, please.
Well, the best way, I guess, is through YouTube. Go to YouTube, and Democracy at Work will get you to our regular program, Economic Update. We do it every week, and it's broadcast as a radio show on about 100 stations across the United States. And as a TV show, we do the two simultaneously. It goes out through the Free Speech TV network and several other networks. And we are told that if the metrics are right, that it goes into about 55 million homes, which is sort of amazing if you think about it, since we are critical of capitalism. We have a very active Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram program. You can get us all on that. We recently tried to branch out and grow, and we produced a book. It's called Understanding Marxism. It's a short book. It's designed to be maximally accessible. The sheer number of questions coming into us from our Patreon community, from our listeners and our viewers and all of that, the number of them asking about Marxism, it's very, very interesting. It's like with socialism. It's somehow back on the agenda of people's interest. So rather than answer the same question 50 times, I wrote this book, short, simple, accessible, and to our amazement, it really has taken off.
Oh, of course, naturally.
So in a month or two, we're going to release Understanding Socialism, a longer book, a companion that I also prepared took the summer to do it. The Understanding Marxism is available both as a hard book and an ebook, and the same will be true for Understanding Socialism. And I'm continuing, as I said to you every time I've been here, I can't tell you the growth in our audience, the growth in interest in what
Fantastic.
we do blows me away. You, I, Bernie, we're all being carried by some remarkable movement that we barely kind of understand, but it's carrying us along in a way. It's a wonderful ride. I just hope it keeps going.
Well, let me just say before we go to the postgame, where it's carrying us is to a really bright, democratic, socialist, and humane future, or Stalinism. Just kidding. All right, see you in the postgame.